9, right here on Channel 6.
From Channel 6, this is Action News, Issues, and Answers, a weekly interview program with the Delaware Valley's most talked-about newsmakers. Now here's Mark Howard.
Good morning. I think it's fair to say that 10 months ago, when people sat around and talked politics in Philadelphia, they thought this would be a rather interesting year. We'd see Lou Blackwell run for mayor against Ron Castile. Didn't work out that way. Not only are they not the candidates for mayor, but we have a Senate race brought on by a tragedy. We have a second congressional race brought on by a resignation. We have an interesting political year and some experts to talk about it in the next half hour. Our guests are Neil Oxman, who's a Democratic political consultant for many years, very busy this year working with the Rendell campaign and others. And to his left is Shanin Specter, who has worked on many Republican campaigns, this year working on his mother's re-election to council campaign. And Vernon Odom is with me to ask some of the questions. Vernon?
Thank you, Mark. Mr. Specter, Republicans are trembling from the White House all the way up the eastern seaboard about what's happening to Dick Thornburgh. The sense is that he's in serious trouble. I interviewed some Republican leaders in Delaware County, where he needs a big turnout the other day, and they said, well, we're glad he's here with a health program now. It's almost midnight. And is he down the tubes, or is he going to pull through?
Vernon, I don't know whether he's going to win or whether he's going to lose. The one thing that I think that we all knew at the outset was that this 44-point lead that Dick Thornburgh had when this campaign started was not going to last or anything close to it. The Democrats enjoy a 350,000 edge in registration in Pennsylvania, and they're enjoying that edge now in Wofford's candidacy. The reality is...
But the Republicans were laughing at Harris Wofford back in the summer.
Well, I wasn't. Harris Wofford is a very capable candidate, and one that we've taken very seriously, as has Dick Thornburgh. I think the problem that Thornburgh has had is that while he's not the incumbent, and Wofford is the incumbent, he has been seen by the electorate as representative of Washington, whereas Harris Wofford has been seen as representative of change. If I can give you one example...
You think he's taking George Bush's whipping over the economy, right?
I think he really has. And let me give you one example of how Thornburgh's differences with Bush have not come through to the electorate. One of the most important issues facing Pennsylvania right now is a continuation of the unemployment compensation fund for people who are out of work. The president opposes continuation of those benefits. Dick Thornburgh has parted company with the president and wants to continue those benefits. Nobody knows it. Thornburgh has not been able to convey that adequately to the voters. People haven't gotten that impression, and the Thornburgh campaign has suffered as a result.
Neil, you're a little surprised, too. We talked about a month ago about this, and you said you thought it might draw closer, but now it's neck and neck.
Well, I was surprised, Vern, because it's remarkable that Dick Thornburgh has tactically run the campaign that he has, which has just clearly been awful. Not only did he have a 44-point lead on August 15th, but he had $1 million in the bank, because he got $1 million from the Republican Senate Campaign Committee, and Harris Wofford didn't have a dime. I mean, he had $100,000 in the bank.
Well, he got $500,000 from the Democrats.
Right, but he didn't get it until much later. I mean, if Dick Thornburgh had spent that money and defined the race on his terms, it wouldn't have been a race. But he didn't do that. By Wofford first going positive and having much better positive ads and staking out a much more clear position on health care, on some other issues, the race narrowed from 40 points to about 20 points. And in the last month, by Wofford doing this terrific negative attack on Thornburgh, informational spots, whatever you want to call them, the momentum is clearly in his favor. I mean, I think Harris Wofford is going to win this race by a margin that will literally stun people on Tuesday.
You buy his analysis, Shannon?
I think there's a lot to what Neil says in terms of the political intricacies of how the race has gotten to the point that we are today. Of course, when the spot is your spot, you call it informational. When it's the other guy's spot, you call it negative.
But Thornburgh is not a novice. I mean, he may be the Dukakis of the year this time.
Well, but Thornburgh has gotten caught up in something, Vernon, which is bigger than all of us, which is the really unhappy aspect of the voters' attitudes toward government generally, toward the Bush administration, toward the recession that we have. What Thornburgh is facing, frankly, is much like what he faced in '82 when we had a recession in Pennsylvania, and he barely hung on against an underfinanced opponent, Alan Erdl.
Does he have a chance, or do you agree with Neil?
Oh, I think that Thornburgh may well win the race on Tuesday. I'm a terrible prognosticator. I wouldn't want to jinx Thornburgh by saying he was going to win, because he'd probably lose. I don't know what's going to happen. But one thing that I think is clear, and that is the voters are angry, and currently they're blaming Dick Thornburg for the problems that exist in this state and in this country.
It's interesting that, you know, you're in the business of doing television commercials, and we sell them, I guess, so I'll ask a question that's maybe prejudiced against our industries, but it seems to me that most of what we know about both of these candidates this year is what we're getting on their commercials. In other words, they are packaging these little 30-second items that they want us to know. And Wofford seems to be doing, in your opinion, a better job. Is it that simple? That they're
No,
simply...
I mean, I disagree to one extent, Mark, and that is that when you asked people this summer what they knew about Dick Thornburg, almost everybody in Pennsylvania, because he had been a two-term governor, he was the Attorney General of the United States, had an opinion, and it was an overwhelmingly favorable opinion about Dick Thornburg. The interesting thing is Dick Thornburg, what Shanin referred to in '82, he's allowed this to happen to him twice. In 1982, when John Hines was winning the United States Senate seat in a re-election campaign by 600,000 or 700,000 votes, Thornburg just squeaked by Alan Erdl, and it's remarkable that he didn't learn from that mistake. But I mean, by and large, yes. Do people read newspapers anymore? Not as frequently as they used to. Circulation of newspapers is down. TV, people watch news on TV. They watch entertainment on TV. We buy spots. By the way, this campaign really wasn't negative just until a few weeks ago. Until 28 days out, neither candidate had run a negative ad. And even during that time, the race went from 65-21 to 55-35. So that shows you that just by running reasonable positive ads about health care. I mean, that's all Harris Wofford was talking about. Health care, health care, health care. That narrowed a 44-point lead to about a 20-point lead. So, you know, it's surprising that Thornburg didn't wake up 4 or 5 weeks ago and say, hey, something's going on here. It happened to me in '82. I'm not going to get caught up in it again.
Here's a tough one, Shanin. If Mr. Thornburg loses, and decides that he still wants to be in the Senate, next spring he's liable to try to run against Senator Specter in the primary. Has that possibility been talked about at the dinner table at home?
No, it hasn't, Mark. I don't think that Dick Thornburg would run for that seat. I think he may well win on Tuesday. If he does, that matter would be moot. And then, of course, your question will be, well, will Harris Wofford run next year for the Senate against my dad? And who knows? You know, we take these races one at a time.
So if Thornburg loses, you're essentially saying he's damaged goods and he wouldn't be very viable next spring, right?
Vernon, not at all.
That's not what I'm reading between the lines there. Okay.
Well,
all right.
You know, it's a funny thing. I was on this show 2 years ago following the DA's race with Ed Rendell sitting to my right. And you fellows were talking about how he was washed up and so forth, and he's gone on to a position now where he is a prohibitive favorite, at least according to everything I read in the newspapers, to win the race on Tuesday. So one election loss or 2 election losses, even more than 2, does not make a political loser.
Your father, of course, is also a living testament to that, having been defeated a couple of times on his way to the Senate.
As has Bob Casey. In fact, I think it's almost a yes, it's a requirement. You have to lose in order to win.
Well, I was going to say, I want to move on to the mayoral race?
Well, I want to ask one more question about this Senate thing. You predict Wofford will win it.
And I think he's going to win by a margin that's closer. I think he's going to win 54-46. I think he's going to get 53 or 54% of the vote.
You poll, Neil.
Yes.
Do you
we
have
polled
polling
just a few
data to
nights
that
ago
effect?
in Philadelphia. 6 weeks ago in Philadelphia, 8 weeks ago, Dick Thornburg was winning this town 48-29 by 19 points. Just a few days ago, in the middle of the week, post the last mayoral debate, we polled. Harris Wofford was winning 59-32. Now, of course, he's going to, I mean, everybody expects a Democrat to win, but the interesting thing was 9 years ago, the weekend before the election, Alan Erdl was still losing Philadelphia to Dick Thornburg 53-35. And then lost and Thornburg lost the city 66-34. I think Dick Thornburg is going to lose Philadelphia 2-1. Wofford is going to do better in the suburbs than people think, and he's going to hold his Democratic vote in southwestern Pennsylvania. He's going to win by a wide margin.
That's what I was going to ask. Let me ask the Mark Howard question. What does he need coming out of the city? Wofford, what are the numbers to look for Tuesday
luckily
night?
for Harris Wofford, Philadelphia is usually 13% of the statewide vote. But because all the other 65 counties in Pennsylvania have races that are of lower interest, they're county commission races, and Philadelphia has a mayoral race, and even though it is not as hotly contested in certain ways as it has in the past, Philadelphia, instead of being 13% of the statewide vote, will be 17, 18, 19, or 20. And Wofford will win it probably 2-1. will win the city by 100 or 125,000 votes, I predict.
You think that'll be enough, though?
Oh, absolutely.
Because ordinarily you need, what, 250?
Right, except they're not going to be three. When Shanin's dad runs for the United States Senate, usually 3 to 4 million people vote. You'll only have 2 or 2.5 million people vote in Pennsylvania on Tuesday, and a 125,000 vote win goes a fairly long way.
Shanin, what about the 2nd District congressional race? That's another factor maybe we ought to put in there. That court decision was bad news.
Well,
wasn't it not for him?
I do think that creates a greater problem for Thornburg, because you will probably have a higher turnout in that district than you would have had if there had been no race for Congress.
That's 80% black, heavily Democratic.
No question about it. On the other hand, one factor that militates against that is that a lot of folks are going to be going in and voting for John White or Fatah. If they do that, they cannot pull the straight Democratic lever. And that requires those voters then to make an individual choice on the Senate race. Dick Thornburg carried a narrow majority of black voters in 1978. He got a healthy vote in '82 against Alan Erdel. He may get a better vote in the black community than one might think, especially because many voters who would otherwise be inclined to pull the straight lever will not be doing so. May I comment briefly on Neil's analysis? The polling and the numbers confused me. I think at one point the numbers add up to 101. But
what's a point or two here?
Stop. You sound like your dad at the Thomas hearings, and that wasn't, you know.
But here comes a cheap shot. Now,
no, it was legitimate. It was
legitimate. Okay. Well, my sense of it is that traditionally a Democrat needs to come out of Philadelphia with 150,000 vote majority in order to offset the Republican strength in the suburbs and in the so-called T in Pennsylvania. One of the problems that Wofford has this year is that the registrants in Philadelphia are at a low since the 1930s. And there just are not the pool of voters to draw from that you would normally have, which would permit Wofford to have the kind of edge in Philadelphia he needs statewide, even recognizing that there will be a bigger turnout in the city than there will be in the other counties in the state.
Well, those of us who aren't experts are looking for maybe 400,000 votes on Tuesday.
That's
Is
what
that
I
a
think.
reasonable?
A 50% turnout of 800.
And you're guessing that Ed and the Democrats get 250 or 275 to maybe 100?
I think Rendell's going to get, 60 to 65, 57 to 65%.
Dovetailing into the mayor's race from here, is there any way in the world that you could see something bizarre happening? For example, is it possible that enough black people will say, wait a minute, Dennis Wesley's not a bad guy, and that they will leave the Democratic line, go to Dennis Wesley, and leave Joe Egan somehow able to pull off the miracle of the century?
It would be the miracle of the century. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen. I think Ed's going to win by a comfortable margin, just around 60% of the vote. I don't think Joe's run a very good campaign. I think he's going to get around 30. I do think Wesley will get 3 or 4 or 5% as Pam Lawler will. So I think that the 2 major candidates will only end up with 90 between them, and the other 4 minor party candidates will end up with about 10% among the 4 of them.
And you would agree, wouldn't you, that certainly Wesley and probably Lawler as well will take votes from Ed, not votes from the Republicans?
No, it's interesting. In our polls, one-on-one, it's Egan who drops. And the reason is that Rendell's so well known that people have made their minds up about him. When you give people other choices, they fall off from Joe. I mean, I've shown some of these polls to people, but in two-way race, the poll that you had on TV, the Borsky poll, he did a 2-way and a 4-way. In a 2-way, it was actually a little bit narrow. When it was a 4-way, Egan drops as many votes as we do. So it's it really has very little effect.
Can you put a better face on that for your party, Shane?
I think that Rendell, if the polls are to be believed, is a very strong favorite on Tuesday. As Yogi Berra says, it's not over till it's over. Who knows what's going to happen? I'm sure that if Neil were 100% sure that Rendell would win, he'd pull his TV ads and save his money for some other day. But in politics, you're never sure about anything until the last vote is counted, and we'll see what happens on Tuesday. I think that Joe Egan has not run a poor campaign. I think Joe Egan has had a very poor circumstance which has confronted him. I think he's done as good a job as anyone could have done in that circumstance. He had to deal with the death of Frank Rizzo. It was a 13-week campaign. He had no experience running for public office. I think he's acquitted himself well. I think one thing that people feel about Joe Egan, if nothing else, is that he's a fine guy who has done the best he could under a very difficult circumstance. He's got a good record in city government. He'll be around after next Tuesday, win, lose, or draw. And I think that he can be proud of himself, and those people that are supporting him on Tuesday can be proud to be associated with his campaign.
Sounds like you've described one of those nice guys that Leo DeRocher, rest his soul, said always finish last. In a moment, we'll be back to talk about what might have been. What if Frank Rizzo were in this race for mayor of Philadelphia? Issues and Answers continues.
A new Ford Escort LX for $99.99. Which Escort LX? It's the price of the 3-door, the new 4-door sedan, the 5-door, and even the wagon. That's right, it's your choice. 4 Escorts, one price. And all equipped with air conditioning, AM/FM stereo radio, power steering, rear defroster, power mirrors, and more. That's right, one price, $99.99 on the Escort LX at your Quality Plus Ford dealer.
I used to get birthday cards on my birthday. Sometimes I'd open them and try to read them, and it was like, forget it, and I'd get frustrated and throw them away. And last year, for the first time, I turned 25 last October, and every card I got for my birthday, I was able to read. So I value them, I held on to them, and I'll always hold on to them.
It costs you nothing to gain the confidence to read. For information, call the number in your area.
One of these travelers knows that some payphones are connected to operator service companies you've never heard of. Some who can charge 2 to 3 times more than AT&T for long-distance calls. One of them knows a way to avoid being overcharged is to dial 10-ATT-0 and the number. Which one knows all this? The one who isn't being taken to the cleaners. 10-ATT-0 for fair prices and quality service. We're always there to help.
And when I went down to the money store, I knew exactly what I was getting.
We guarantee the low fixed rate on your home equity loan will never go up. Listen to homeowner John Hine of Mine Hill, New Jersey.
I definitely wanted a fixed rate. I wanted to know that my payment would be X number of dollars every month, and I didn't have to worry. Not only did I get a fixed rate, but I got a very equitable fixed rate. It was a place to go for us.
See for yourself how low our rates can be. Call the money store right now. 1-800-LOAN-YES.
We're talking to Neil Oxman and Shanin Specter, a couple of experts on political matters, and it is a fair question, Neil. What if Frank Rizzo had lived? This certainly would have been a much messier campaign. He clearly was going after it in a big way. Do you think he could have won?
It would certainly have been a different dynamic, Mark. I mean, our polls indicate that he wouldn't have done it. Frank hadn't won a campaign, a general election, since 1975. He loses the charter change in the fall of '78. He lost to Wilson in '87. I think Ed would have won the election in '83. I mean, loses the primary in '83. But it clearly would have been a different dynamic. He would have been much more well-funded than Joe. He had a following. He was trying to do a very serious populist movement. He was reaching out to every community before he passed away. I mean, he was campaigning in black areas. It would have been an interesting race. I mean, we were expecting a tough race. We were preparing for a dirty campaign and Rizzo to spend a lot of money, but it's hard to say. I think it probably would have been a closer campaign because, of course, Rizzo's voters never show up in polls. I mean, even when you have a 35 or 40 point lead, things, interestingly, in 1987 in the fall, the weekend before the election, Wilson Good's poll showed him up by 10 or 12 points. He won by 2. When I did the Good campaign in the primary of '83, the weekend before the election, we were beating Rizzo by 17%. We won by 9. Shanin worked for Castile, and I know that there were some hidden votes in that primary. So it would have been a very interesting dynamic, and for a lot of people, they would have been much more involved probably this fall than they have been.
You say you were preparing for a dirty campaign. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, what Rizzo pulled in the primary against Castile, I expected him to be vicious, and those guys do a lot of negative and talk about parking tickets and the silliness that people talked about in Rendell's past campaigns, snowballs, all that other sort of stuff that had been brought up.
What would have been your tactic as opposed to Castile's, which was to denounce it, but apparently not to come out swinging?
I think that the issues about Frank Rizzo had been litigated. Frank Rizzo had been mayor of Philadelphia for 8 years, and most people feel that he did not do a good job. I mean, certainly since he's passed away, there's been a lot of rewriting of history. But if you ask the average Philadelphian about Rizzo's time as mayor, they do not remember it as a pleasant time. There are a lot of financial problems. He gave us the largest tax increase in history, and he lied about it before his last election. He certainly was part of the problem with giving unions a great many giveaways before contracts and before negotiating times.
But you could have offset, you think, the negative campaigning with that sort of stuff?
I think if we had reminded people of that, and I think if Ron Castile had run a better campaign, he could have done it in the primary in 1991.
Now, Shanin, looking back before Frank Rizzo died, there was talk that instead of seeing 4 Republicans on city council, we might have seen 5, possibly 6. Now there's talk that we're liable to see only 3, and conceivably we could only see 2 before it's all over. And some people are even suggesting that your mother might lose her seat because Larry Tabus is number 2 on the Republican list, having replaced Joe Egan, who actually came in ahead of your mother in the primary. How do you see council going?
Well, I think that the Democrats will win the 5 at-large seats. I think that they have a shot to pick up 2 of the district races. I think that those are in question right now.
Brian O'Neill, you think could lose?
No, not Brian. I think that Jack Kelly could lose, and I think that Connie McHugh could lose that race, which is
you were counting that
currently open,
yeah.
But she could lose that race. The reality is that the race became very, very difficult for the Republicans when Frank Rizzo died. Really, it became difficult when Ed Rendell won the primary. And Neil has done a great job, and my hat's off to him. He's done a marvelous job with a very good candidate, but really done a great job with the TV ads and with expressing Rendell's viewpoints on the issues. I think they've run a nearly flawless campaign. I think the die was cast to the extent that it is cast today. It was cast on primary election night when Rendell won a resounding victory. One problem that Joe Egan had in running for mayor was that a lot of people that might potentially have been for Joe against Ed Rendell had already committed themselves in the Rendell-Rizzo race. So that I think that it was very difficult, really from the moment that Rendell won a smashing victory in the primary, to win the mayoralty.
Shanin, let me go inside the Republican Party and start off with the old Chinese proverb that you ride the tiger for so long, eventually you can't dismount. Frank Rizzo was a big hero in the Republican Party 4 years ago, but the troubles began this year as soon as Castile got in and Rizzo was in there and Sam Katz. So some of this was perhaps doomed last spring, was it not? I mean, with the Rizzo divisiveness, his antipathy towards Castile, it's divided things right down the middle. They haven't recovered. True enough?
Well, even the Rizzo family, we should add here.
Absolutely. Look at their
family is
right.
Yeah.
So
it's been a tough year, and I'm not sure that any of the Republicans, and I would include Rizzo, Katz, Castile, and Egan, I'm not sure that any of them would have beaten Ed Rendell. Given the way the Rendell showed in the primary. But I would agree.
Is that because the Republicans wouldn't have had a race vote to work with no black candidate at the top of the Democratic ticket?
No,
is that not what you're saying?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, Ron Castile won a landslide victory against Wally Phillips. It's not a matter of race. I think that the biggest factor is that in Rendell, people sort of had the feeling that it's his turn. You know, he's been around a long time, and he has worked very hard to become mayor, and I think that there's sort of, among those people who were lukewarm toward him, there's now a sort of grudging admiration of how he's hung in there, and I think that is a major factor in his emergence. With Egan, you have someone who was an unknown quantity. With Rizzo, you had somebody with a lot of negatives.
Let's turn the clock back a ways, though. Neil, when you polled Castile versus Rendell way back before the first
a year ago, it was a competitive race.
It was.
1 week before the primary, we were clocking him. I mean, Ron Castile.
Rizzo beat him up.
Rizzo beat him up horribly. Ron, I expected a much better campaign. Here's a guy who goes out and spends $1 million and runs a very good campaign for re-election as DA. And I think that Ed, I agree with Shanin, I think Ed would have beaten anybody in the general election.
But going way back, if you go back to January, Billy Meehan's instincts apparently were correct.
Absolutely.
If he could get Ron Castile and no clean race, no competition.
And then, of course, Sam Katz emerged as a very good, I mean, I agree with Shanin. I don't want to say that Joe didn't. I mean, Joe has acquitted himself well. I agree. He's been put in a very difficult situation. I think that this problem rests at the feet of Billy Meehan, who, had he picked Sam Katz, we would have also had a very different general election because Sam was a known quantity. When you first get in a campaign as widely looked at as a mayor's race, with the press doing what it can to expose you in every way, you make mistakes. Sam Katz made mistakes when he became a candidate last fall, but he overcame them. He became a better candidate. And Joe only had 14 weeks. He became the candidate 14 weeks. So I think Billy made a mistake and choosing. Luckily for us, I'm glad he did.
Which brings up Billy Meehan. You want?
I do want to get to that. Frank Rizzo brought them many new numbers 4 years ago when he came over there, and he got close to Wilson Good. But this time, he helped tear right into Ron Castile and tear up, essentially, to use a euphemism, the golden boy that the Republicans were banking on. So that divisiveness got you this time right out of the chute, didn't it, Shanin?
We've had a tough year. There's
and
no
what was
question
supposed
about
to
it.
be their best chance in 40 years.
No, well, I don't. I've never agreed with that. Let me say that at the outset. I've never agreed this was our best shot in 40 years. Our best shot was, the last 40 years was in 1967. Our second best shot was in 87. Wilson Good was a more vulnerable incumbent than Ed Rendell was as running for an open seat this year. We had a good shot to win the race. We've had a lot of difficult circumstances this year. But let me remind you that Philadelphia is
but
the
things got difficult when Frank Rizzo started going after Castile there, and they had that battle.
Well, Frank Rizzo had a right to run for mayor and to do so in whatever way he thought was appropriate. Ron Castile had an obligation to fight back. He did the best he could. Things occurred as you saw them. Let me make one other point, if I may. Our party, the Republican Party, has had a tough year. That is true. But let me also point out to you that it's the only Republican Party in any big city in America that is viable, that can run candidates for mayor, that can run candidates and win for DA or for city controller, that can hold their own in statewide races, thereby allowing people like my dad and Dick Thornburg to run competitively across the state.
Real quick, we're running out of time. Is Billy Meehan going to remain the boss of the party? I know he's the counselor or some other title, but will he remain the boss in the next year or two?
Every 4 years, people complain about Bill Meehan, but in the intervening 3, he goes about the drudgery and the difficult job of running a party organization. If somebody else wants to step forward and take the keys away from him, I'm sure that he'd be glad to consider it because it's a no-fun job. People like to bash him, but no one's ready to come forward and do the job.
But I've heard your father say he doesn't love the idea that one man picks candidates. He'd like to see a more democratic process.
Well, I think that Bill Meehan has a difficult task to try to run an organization like he does in the city of Philadelphia.
Before we run out of time, do you want to tell us how you think the council will shape up? Shanin, are you saying that you think there'll be 3 Republicans left, 4 Republicans on council?
I'm not going to prognosticate because I'm so poor at it. I think that my mother will lead the ticket among Republican candidates for council.
She'll beat Thatcher Longstreth?
I think she probably will. Well, she did in '87. I think she will again this year.
Okay.
And I think that Thatcher will also win.
So there'll be at least 2, probably 3.
And of course, Brian.
Brian.
Sure.
I do. I agree with Shane. I think that
3.
Mrs. Specter will win, but I also think it will only be 3. And I think Brian O'Neill is going to have a much closer race than he's ever had.
Kelly loses, you think, huh?
Kelly loses, and Joe Vignola beats Connie McHugh.
Aren't Democratic Party pros going to cut some of the Democrats out there who are pro-Rendell in order to get Street in as council president? That rumor's floating around, folks.
I don't think so.
Didn't start with me.
That's too inside.
So. Well, not...
On that internecine
It'll be right out
note,
there in January.
Tune in Tuesday night. Action News. We'll count all the votes. We'll tell you what happens. Thank you both for joining us, Neil Oxman and Shanin Specter. Thanks to Vernon Odom for Action News Issues and Answers. I'm Mark Howard, and we'll all see you Tuesday night.